1984, Nova Scotia. A remote valley swallowed by fog, where the trees leaned over crooked paths as if guarding the land itself. The wind whispered through the hills, carrying sounds that could not be explained. Low, guttural murmurs, the faint creak of timber long abandoned, and an occasional cry that seemed too human to ignore. In this hidden corner of the world, a family lived entirely removed from everyone else. They were known by the locals only in hushed tones, their name spoken with a mixture of fear and disbelief. What went on within their walls, within the small, weathered cabins dotting the overgrown land, was beyond imagination. Strange shapes moved in the shadows, figures whose presence made the air thick and heavy. No one who entered ever left with a sense of normalcy, and yet the world outside continued as if unaware. If you were walking along that narrow path today, fog curling around your ankles, and you heard footsteps behind you that did not belong to you, would you step forward or turn and run? Could you survive what waited in the heart of the valley, untouched and hidden for decades? As you move deeper into the valley, the fog thickens, curling over the uneven ground like a living thing, and the trees close in, their branches scratching against one another in low, uneven rhythm. The cabins, scattered at irregular intervals, seem to lean toward one another, as though whispering among themselves. Some are half buried in weeds, their roofs sagging, boards splintering and warped from decades of relentless weather. Smoke rises from chimneys here and there, carrying a faint, acrid odor that lingers in the air, mingling with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. Few outsiders ever approached this place, and those who did carried the memory of it with a quiet dread that never left them. Locals spoke of the family only in whispers, tales of figures that moved strangely, of children with hollow stares, of adults whose expressions betrayed thoughts no one could dare speak aloud. The valley seemed to bend reality itself, where the air felt heavier, and the silence between the rustling of leaves carried weight. Imagine, if you will, stumbling upon such a place in 1984. Would you pause at the edge, sensing something was wrong? Or would curiosity drive your steps forward? Could you have survived long enough to witness what truly lay inside those walls? Even now, decades later, the stories carry a sense of dread that refuses to fade, leaving the valley alive in memory, and those who venture near it haunted by what they glimpsed, even for the briefest of moments. At the heart of the valley, among the clusters of rotting cabins and tangled undergrowth, lived the Goler family. Few names in Nova Scotia carried the weight of both curiosity and fear, and theirs was whispered cautiously in every nearby town. To those who saw them from a distance, they appeared unremarkable at first glance, blending into the fog and the trees as though they belonged more to the landscape than to the world beyond it. But there was something in the way they moved that set them apart, a stiffness, a rhythm that seemed out of sync with the ordinary. Children lingered at doorways, their eyes wide and unblinking, watching anyone who dared pass, yet saying nothing. Adults went about their days with a quiet intensity, performing tasks with motions that were precise, almost ritualistic. And when they spoke to one another, the words were low, clipped, and impossible for outsiders to decipher. Stories reached the nearest settlements in fragments that refused to fit together in any sensible pattern. A neighbor might mention the sound of children laughing in the distance, yet the cabins closest to them remained eerily silent. Another would recall seeing figures at dusk, their bodies hunched, hands twisted unnaturally, moving in ways that were difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore. Imagine standing there yourself, the fog closing in around you, and hearing whispers float through the trees. The valley seems to shift, the wind carrying voices, footsteps, or perhaps just the mind's imagination straining under the weight of fear. Would you have dared step closer, or would instinct have held you back? Could any human fully comprehend what life had become for those living inside those walls, isolated from every watchful eye and untouched by the rhythm of the outside world? The cabins of the Goler family were small, crumbling structures, barely standing against the relentless Nova Scotia weather. Their walls sagged under the weight of years, boards warped and twisted as if bending away from some unseen pressure. The roofs were patched unevenly, and windows were cracked or missing entirely, letting the cold wind whip through and carrying the scent of damp earth and decay inside. Inside, the floors were uneven, littered with straw, scraps of cloth, and the remnants of meals long past. Each room told the story of survival on the edge of human endurance, yet it was survival of a strange, distorted kind. Life inside the valley followed its own rhythm, one that outsiders could never understand. The family rose with the pale light of dawn, moving with a quiet intensity that spoke more of necessity than comfort. Food was scarce, collected from the surrounding land, hunted, foraged, and often prepared in ways that would have seemed bizarre or even repulsive to a visitor. The air was heavy with the mingling of smoke, earth, and the faint, bitter tang of things left to rot. Children and adults alike moved with an odd precision, almost mechanical in their actions. Their eyes, often fixed on tasks, sometimes flicked toward the edges of the room or forest, wary and watchful, as though expecting intruders or threats that no one else could see. Their speech was minimal, punctuated by strange gestures, sudden silences, and long, tense pauses. Visitors, rare as they were, noticed immediately the difference between this world and the one beyond the fog. The valley seemed to contain its own rules, its own pulse, one that did not belong to the outside. And yet, amidst the decay and isolation, there was a strange cohesion. The family moved as one, a unit bound not by choice, but by circumstance, survival, and a history that had been layered over generations. The air seemed to thrum with a quiet tension, the sense that even the slightest misstep could awaken something long contained within the valley's shadows. Imagine standing at the edge of that clearing, the fog curling around your ankles, the wind carrying faint noises, footsteps that do not belong to you, whispers that cannot be traced, and realizing that you are witnessing a way of life that has been hidden from the world for decades. Could you endure it, or would the valley claim your attention, hold you, until you understood its rules, whether you wished to or not? As the days passed in the valley, certain patterns became impossible to ignore. Visitors, rare, cautious, and fleeting, spoke of strange habits, behaviors that seemed almost unnatural, and faces that lingered in memory long after leaving. Children appeared to move with a deliberateness that was unsettling, their gestures and expressions stiff, their eyes holding a depth of awareness that no child should possess. Adults, too, carried an intensity that bordered on obsession, attending to tasks with meticulous care, yet their glances often betrayed a wariness, a constant measuring of the space around them. Whispers among the neighboring settlements hinted at deformities, strange appearances among the youngest members of the family, though these accounts were fragmented, contradictory, and rarely spoken aloud. It was enough, however, to seed unease, glimpses of limbs that seemed too short, heads slightly misshapen, or movements that felt wrong. These were not stories designed to frighten. They were observations, stubborn details that refused to be ignored. The valley itself seemed to conspire with their isolation. Fog rolled in heavier than before, muffling sound and warping perception. Creaking floors, the rustle of unseen creatures, faint cries, sometimes human, sometimes not, followed anyone who dared enter. Imagine watching the family from a distance, a child appearing at a doorway, staring without blinking, an adult moving across a clearing in slow, deliberate steps, pausing abruptly, as if sensing your gaze. What are they aware of that you are not? What rules govern this hidden world that you cannot see? And yet, the horror was subtle at first, building patiently, layer by layer. There was no scream, no sudden attack, only the creeping realization that this family, this valley, had existed for decades under its own laws that were unknowable, terrifying, and complete. Could you stand there, feeling the fog curl around your feet, the dampness cling to your skin, and tell yourself that you were safe? Or would the awareness of being watched, studied, and measured gnaw at your mind until it refused to let go? By the mid-1980s, those who had glimpsed the Goler family up close could no longer ignore what had quietly festered over generations. Isolation had left its mark not only on their minds, but on their bodies. Children with limbs that bent at odd angles, faces marked by features passed down through generations, moved through the fog-bound clearing with a precision that was unnerving. Adults, their expressions carefully controlled, carried the weight of a world that had shrunk to the size of a single valley, one that dictated everything: birth, survival, even how one looked at another. The cabins themselves were almost extensions of the family, narrow, dark, and unwelcoming, with interiors littered in ways that hinted at practices impossible to fully comprehend. Personal space, privacy, the simple comfort of light and warmth. These were luxuries unknown here. The floors bore the marks of movement repeated countless times, the air thick with scents that clung to the skin and lingered long after leaving. It was a world governed entirely by its own rules. Adults moved with authority, yet there was a haunting strain in their eyes, a mixture of suspicion, exhaustion, and something that suggested memory and history too deep and twisted to name. The children followed patterns they had never learned in schools or streets, responding to cues invisible to outsiders, repeating gestures that seemed part of some inherited rhythm. And when visitors dared to linger, however briefly, they often left with a lingering unease, a sensation that the family had been watching them, measuring them, understanding them in ways impossible to describe. Imagine stepping through one of those crooked doorways, the cold air pressing down, hearing the faint scuttling of movement behind closed walls, feeling eyes on you that had never blinked, never looked away. Could you endure a night in such a place, where every shadow belonged to someone or something, aware of your presence? Could you stand without being swallowed by the weight of it all, by the unyielding rhythm of a family that had lived apart from the world for decades, untouched by its rules or judgment? Eventually, the outside world reached into the valley. Authorities, neighbors, and a few daring journalists stepped cautiously through the mist, expecting to find only remnants of life and neglect. What they discovered, however, was a reality far more unsettling than rumors had suggested. The cabins were occupied, the family intact, yet the air was thick with a history that could not be explained simply by poverty or isolation. Children, some unrecognizable in their features, moved silently from room to room, observing without speaking, while adults regarded the newcomers with a watchfulness that bordered on calculation. The valley seemed to resist intrusion. Even as evidence was collected, photographs taken and records made, it was clear that this was not a place shaped by the outside world. It had shaped itself, in a pattern that had stretched for generations. Neighbors whispered of long-forgotten warnings, strange habits noticed from a distance, children left to wander the forests, adults who never left their homes. These were not tales meant to frighten. They were fragments of a reality that had existed, quietly, unseen and unchallenged. The outsiders could document the place, describe the conditions, and try to make sense of it. But the valley itself remained unchanged, holding on to the echoes of every life that had passed through it. And so, even as the family was removed, studied, or taken into care, the memory of the Goler clan continued to linger. Could any of those who witnessed it ever forget the weight of the fog pressing down, the sight of unblinking eyes in the doorway, or the rhythm of a world entirely their own? Could you have survived it, even for a single night, or would the valley have left its mark on you forever? Even decades later, the story refuses to fade, leaving a shadow that stretches far beyond the cabins, into the imagination of anyone who dares to listen. Even after the family was removed from the valley, the place did not feel empty. The fog remained, curling through the trees with the same deliberate persistence, carrying with it faint echoes of life that no outsider could fully comprehend. The cabins, though abandoned, seemed to hold memories of countless days and nights, a rhythm, a pulse that had not been broken. Some who returned years later spoke of shadows that moved where none should be, whispers that came from nowhere, and the feeling of being watched, measured, studied by eyes long gone. Objects were shifted, footprints appeared in the mud, and the wind seemed to carry faint laughter or cries that belonged to neither the living nor the dead. The valley had taken decades to shape itself, generation upon generation, leaving traces that lingered long after the last member of the Goler clan had departed. It was as if the very land remembered them, imprinting their existence into every tree, every stone, every path. Imagine standing there now, decades later, and feeling the weight of history pressing against your skin, the air thick with stories that no one can tell fully, and secrets that refuse to be unearthed. Would you dare to return to that fog-laden valley, knowing what has been whispered, what has been seen, and what has been left behind? Could you walk its paths and not feel the eyes of the past following you, studying, remembering, and perhaps judging? Some stories refuse to end. Some places refuse to let go. The Goler clan may be gone, but the valley, their home, their prison, their legacy, remains, waiting for the next soul to step inside.